Good afternoon. Today we have our guest speaker, Alex Lewin, who will discuss the University of Toledo processes for addressing complaints of discrimination and harassment made against students and provide information about resources available on our campuses. Alex is the Associate Director of Student Conduct and Community Standard at the University of Toledo. She's from California, a beautiful area. Alex received her Bachelor of Fine Arts from the California Institute of the Arts, her Master in College Students Personnel from Bowling Green State University, and she right now is pursuing a doctorate degree in Leadership Studies at the BGSU. Alex is passionate about supporting college students at all levels in making positive life decisions that aid them in attaining their academic, personal, and career goals. Thank you, Alex, for being here. And please,
Thank
you
you
again.
Thank you so much. Yes, I am from California, where it is probably warmer than it is right now here, but I love this part of the country too. So as I was introduced, I am going to speak about our processes here at the university for addressing specifically discrimination and harassment. This is also similar to a lot of our other conduct processes, so there'll be some crossover. And if at any point people have questions, they can go ahead and put that in the chat or ask me. And then also I'll make sure that my information is provided so that if anybody does want to follow up and ask questions later, that's also a possibility. So I'm going to just start with telling you a little bit about our office. So we're a pretty small office. There are 2 full-time staff members there. So myself, I'm the associate director, and then Brad Lettingham, who is the coordinator of the Office of Student Conduct and Community Standards. I've been at the University of Toledo for coming up on 4 years. It'll be 4 years in June. And Brad, I think, has been here for 9 years, and he worked in residence life before he came over to our office. We're located in the Student Union. We're part of what's called CASE, which is the Center for Advocacy and Student Experience. That's a kind of a new center on campus that brought together a couple different offices that are all focused on supporting our students when they're going through difficult times, things like that. So it's a great place if you do need support with anything. One of the things we kind of tell people is if you don't really know where to go, you can come to us. As medical folks, though, you all have a lot of fantastic support over there in your college as well. So we are here as an additional support if you ever need it. One of the things I think is really important for people to know about our office and about our processes is kind of what drives us. So I'm going to go through what the mission is of the office. So the Office of Student Conduct and Community Standards utilizes an educational and restorative process to create a system of accountability for student behavior. We encourage students to engage in reflection regarding their personal and academic success at the University of Toledo. So what that means is that our process is not based in punitive measures. We are really focused on that educational and restorative piece. Our goal is to retain our students, to help them figure out how do they make some changes, how do they learn from the things that have happened and move forward in a more positive manner. We also want to restore any of that harm that has been done if possible. And on occasion, that restoration does look like a separation from the university for a temporary or potentially permanent period. So that is kind of the worst case or the most severe case, but in most of our situations, what we're really focusing on is that educational piece of the process. And so there are a few different university policies that I want to talk about today that kind of cover what is important to know and what we're going to be looking at. And so the main one that I work with is the Student Code of Conduct. This is really what lays out all of the policies and procedures for our students. For you all as medical students or folks in some of our other professional programs, there are oftentimes additional codes, standards of ethics or professionalism, that kind of stuff that you need to be conscious of as well. The Student Code of Conduct applies to all of our students, and it applies based on a jurisdiction of their identity as a student, not based on a location. So from the moment a student is accepted to the University of Toledo until they separate from the university, either finally or for over 2 semesters consecutively, they are considered a student. So that includes, on breaks, summer break, winter break, spring break, study abroad, if you are doing a rotation or a clinical or something like that at another hospital somewhere else, all of those times you are still considered a student at the university and you're still covered under the Student Code of Conduct. We also cover behavior of student groups and student organizations under there. So most typically people think about things like fraternity and sorority life, but of course we have all kinds of other student groups and student organizations that we have to address their behavior sometimes too. And what's important to understand about the Student Code of Conduct is that we only respond to behavioral misconduct. So we are not looking at academic misconduct that typically goes through the individual colleges and programs. Occasionally there's some crossover, but primarily that is what we're focused on through our office and through the Student Code of Conduct. When we're talking about discrimination, harassment, there are 2 other policies that are really important to consider. The first one is Title IX, and so Title IX applies to students and employees, and it's basically a law that requires that the university avoid any kind of discrimination based on sex or gender. It's a sexual harassment based law, and so that's what we're looking at with Title IX. Title IX does have some very specific jurisdictional pieces, and a lot of that changed in 2020 when the regulations were kind of adapted under the administration that was in the federal government at that time. And so one of the big changes was the narrowing of jurisdiction for Title IX. So primarily Title IX applies to behavior that occurs on campus or within an educational activity, property owned or run by the university, that kind of stuff. And with Title IX, there's also the ability to receive supportive measures. So even if you are not going through an investigatory process with Title IX, there is still the potential for Title IX to provide support for you. So that means even if a student has been a victim or survivor of a sexual misconduct situation outside of their jurisdiction, prior to coming to the university, things like that, they can still support and make sure that they are providing what they call supportive measures. And then the other policy that I want to talk about is the non-discrimination policy. And the non-discrimination policy also applies to students and employees, and that one is focused on all non-sex or gender-related discrimination. So that would be all the other protected categories. So we think about race, religion, disability status, those kinds of categories. One thing I want to clarify when it does come to sexual misconduct situations is that anything that falls outside of the Title IX jurisdiction in which what we call the respondent is a student, so the person who is alleged to have participated in the behavior, anytime they are a student and is outside the Title IX jurisdiction, it does come through my office, because as a university, we still want to address those things, even if it occurred, off campus, that kind of thing. So I will talk about our process a little bit. I am very familiar with Title IX, so if you do have Title IX questions, I can discuss that too, but I really want to focus on specifically what we do outside of our office. And I would encourage you to follow up on the Title IX website for more information or to speak with them directly too. All of these policies can be found pretty easily on our website. So I suggest if you're looking for those that you go there. I will also put the links to those in the chat once I'm done going through the presentation so that you can find those pretty easily. The Student Code of Conduct goes up for an annual review. So every summer we put that out for review and you can make comments on it. The Title IX policy, I believe, also goes for an annual review. And then the non-discrimination policy, I don't think is annual, but you can always reach out if you do need to make comments or have questions about that. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about kind of how our process works and what it looks like, because I think this is really what a lot of people get confused about and also where there's a lot of stress. And so I try to make this as simplified as possible so that people understand that as a university, we have a very specific way of responding to things that protects all parties involved and lays out all of those various steps. So this is a kind of a flow chart that you can find on our website. And that's helpful, especially if you're more of a visual learner, but I will also kind of walk through that. So with our process, anytime an incident occurs and is reported to us, we start up the top here. So that could be, a standard type of conduct incident, but in this case, we're talking about a discrimination or harassment incident. So, that occurs and there's an allegation of, certain type of behavior. And I will refer to behaviors as alleged behaviors or allegations throughout the process, because we do use the same thing that they use like in a legal process, which is a presumption of innocence. So until we have moved something all the way through the process and determined someone is responsible, we do consider anything an alleged violation. So an incident report comes in or some kind of complaint is received, and the very first thing we do is we look at it for jurisdiction, and we look at it to determine, is this behavior that rises to the level of a potential policy violation? Sometimes something comes into one of our offices and we realize, oh, this is not our jurisdiction, and we pass it over to the correct office to make sure that it does get handled. Sometimes things come in where we are limited in how we can respond. One of the things that comes in a lot that is limited and very difficult, often because it can be hard to deal with behavior, is things that fall under First Amendment or free speech protection. So there are sometimes behaviors that are protected as free speech but are still harmful. And so those can be very difficult because we are limited based on the federal law and our status as a public institution in terms of how we can respond to those types of things. So sometimes it falls under that category, or it just is not, severe enough that it's something that requires a full type of conduct action. And in those cases, we would dismiss the case. If it is a case that belongs in our office, what we would do is move down to kind of right here and determine, do we need more information, or can we move straight forward into the kind of charging phase of our process? A lot of the time, especially when you're talking about discrimination and harassment complaints, it is pretty much necessary that we do an investigation. And so we go over here to this section right here, and we will do a pretty thorough investigation to make sure that we can get as much information as possible. Our investigations are neutral, so our investigators are there to just collect information and put it all together. They're not making a decision. They're not favoring one side or the other. Their job is to really collect all the pieces and put it together into a report that then is where the next steps come from. And so throughout an investigation, we will talk to the person who's made the complaint. We will talk to the person who the complaint is about. We will talk to any relevant witnesses, and we will also collect any relevant information. So that can include things like text messages, photos, screenshots of social media situations, really all kinds of stuff. I've had, medical documentation. I've had receipts. Anything that might be relevant to a situation will become part of an investigation. And I will talk more about investigations in a few minutes as well. Once an investigation is complete, an investigation report is put together, and so that will detail everything that was discovered in the investigation. It will include a credibility assessment, so we'll talk about, were people's stories consistent, things like that, and then that'll get passed over to another staff member to review and determine, is there enough information here to move forward with charges. If there's not enough information and it doesn't warrant a charge, we end up back at this situation where the case gets dismissed. If there is enough information, then we go down to what we call an information meeting. And then that's really where we begin our kind of more formal charging process. So an information meeting is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It's a meeting where we have the opportunity to share a lot of information. So we will talk to any of the students involved that are complainants or respondents about what the allegations are, what information we have available to us. We will review what all of their rights are throughout the process. We will go over what the charges of alleged policy violations are, and then a respondent will be given the opportunity to accept or deny responsibility for those charges. And so very similar to a criminal process, a student basically gets to plead. We do not use the same language as a criminal process because we are not a criminal process, and we do have very different goals and outcomes than a criminal process, but sometimes it's helpful to kind of compare. So we'll basically ask a student to plead and tell us, do they feel like they're responsible or not responsible for violating that policy? And then in that same meeting, we will discuss how can we resolve this situation. So if a student, says they're not responsible, then moving forward, the resolution processes are going to be looking at, did this behavior occur? Was the policy violated? And if so, what should the outcome be? If a student does accept responsibility, then moving forward, you're looking more just at what should the outcome be. We have 4 different resolution options that we use in our office, and the appropriateness of each option really depends on the situation. So in some situations, it's not appropriate to have an informal option and we only provide a formal option. In other situations, we have a little bit more flexibility depending on what the charges are and who is involved. So these options are an administrative review, which is that informal option. That's really done as a conversation between the hearing officer and the student, talking about what occurred, having the student reflect on that, understanding what's going on with the student, looking at, are there some underlying situations that may have led to this behavior? And then how do we best help this student move forward, learn from this situation, restore any of that harm that may be done? Again, those are really for lower level policy violations, things that have not done direct harm to another individual, things like that. Administrative hearing, University Conduct Board, and Sexual Misconduct Board are formal hearing options. So typically we use those if there is a specific complainant who's been harmed in the process or by the behavior, or if the student is facing suspension or expulsion. This is typically the route that they will want to go. They're all very similar in that in any of these, if a student, if there's still a question of responsibility, a student can provide witnesses, bring additional information, kind of similar to a trial. These are recorded hearings and they're given, they're usually done a few weeks later than the information meeting because we want to provide time in order for somebody to gather all that stuff together and prepare themselves for a hearing. The big difference between an administrative hearing and a board hearing is that an administrative hearing just has one hearing officer, so kind of like working with a judge, and a board hearing has a panel of 3 individuals who will hear the case, ask the questions, and then make a decision from there that they make a recommendation onto my office. University Conduct Board is for any type of conduct situations that are not related to sexual misconduct, and then Sexual Misconduct Board is specifically, obviously, for sexual misconduct related situations. The primary difference between those 2 boards is that the folks who serve on the Sexual Misconduct Board have been trained specifically in those types of cases. They understand what kind of questions to ask. They have special trauma-informed training as well, and we only allow employees to serve on that board. With the University Conduct Board, we also allow students to serve so that there can be that opportunity for peer accountability, peer feedback, those kinds of things. Once a hearing is completed, we will put out the outcomes. So if a student is found not responsible, we send a letter indicating such and the case goes away. If a student is found responsible, we send a letter that lists what the sanctions are, and we go from there. Sanctions can range anything from a written warning all the way up through, as I mentioned before, suspension or expulsion. But somewhere in the middle is usually where we fall, really, again, with that focus on the education and the restoration piece. We also like to look a lot at what was underlying for a student when this behavior occurred. We believe firmly that a lot of the behavior we see with our students is kind of a symptom of something else. So we look at, was the student struggling with maybe depression? Are they having a hard time acclimating to the educational environment? Is there something going on at home? Are there ways that we can help address this? Did they just never have the opportunity to learn about this thing previously? And so we need to work on providing that education and filling that gap. So that's a lot of what we're looking at when we are determining what those sanctions and outcomes should be. There is also an opportunity for an appeal in our process. So We don't have very many grounds for appeal. Basically, there has to be a procedural error on the part of the university that substantially changed the outcome of the case, or new information being made available that was not available at the time of the hearing. So not just like, oh, I forgot to mention this, but like, there's suddenly medical documentation or legal documentation, something that we could not get when we had the initial hearing, and that changes the outcome. So those are pretty much the primary grounds for an appeal. Just to like, I don't like this outcome is not really a reasonable grounds, but any appeal that comes in, we will look at it and determine, is there anything that we need to adjust here? So that's kind of the overview of our process. I can't give a firm timeline for how long this takes because it depends on the individual case. Some things move through very quickly, 1 to 2 weeks at the most. Other things can take months. There are some cases where, depending on kind of what's going on, it could be over a year, which I know can sound really scary, but we do try to avoid meeting with students when they have breaks. We also avoid things like exam time. And in addition to that, if there are a lot of witnesses, things like that, it can take time to get people into our offices and complete an investigation. So it really just depends on each individual situation, how long something may take. It's really important for folks to understand that they do have a lot of rights in our process. The first primary right is the right to due process. So that really means that an individual has a right to a hearing. They have a right to understand what information is being alleged, what is being brought against them, who is bringing that information, and an opportunity to defend themselves. Additionally, that presumption of innocence is a big part of due process as well. So that's why we can't just move straight away on a report and suspend or expel somebody based on that initial information that is in there. We have to be able to show, yes, this is what occurred before we can move forward, and a person has a right to be able to defend themselves in that situation. Students have a right to have an advisor or a support person in our process. They can have both of those people if they'd like. These folks are silent participants in the process, so they're not there to speak on behalf of the student. They're there to provide guidance, help a student prepare for things, provide emotional support, that kind of stuff. That can be a person of the student's choosing. So we've had everything from best friends, academic advisors, faculty members, parents, and attorneys, anything like that. So it's really, again, that the person that the student chooses. It should be somebody that they feel comfortable with and that they feel can confidently serve in this role. Students have a right not to participate. So if you don't want to participate in this process, you don't have to. But our process will go ahead anyway. So as a university, we have a responsibility to respond to these types of things, to determine, is there a concern there? Is there a need for education? That kind of stuff. And so even if a student chooses not to participate, regardless of what side of the issue they are on, we are still going to move forward with that process, and decisions will be made with or without their participation. We obviously prefer our students to participate because that helps us in making sure that we have a full picture of the situation, that we're doing what is best for the students involved, all of that kind of stuff. But we also understand sometimes that process can feel too stressful or traumatic, things like that. We want to make sure that students understand that we can provide accommodations for disabilities in our process. So we work closely with our Office of Accessibility and Disability Resources to make sure that we do that. And that can look like a number of different things. For some students, it's just a way, has to do with how we, provide the information. So they may need everything printed, things like that. For other students, it can look like extensions on time, additional folks to support them, things like that. I've had sign language interpreters in my meetings, all kinds of different people. So we will make sure that if a student needs that they can get those accommodations as well. Students have the right to see all the materials and information that is in their case. We are not trying to hide anything from a student or confuse them, or kind of surprise them with anything. We want to make sure they know exactly what information is in there and is being brought in this allegation. So we will show them everything at an information meeting. And then if more information is provided prior to a hearing, an entire hearing packet is also sent with all of that information. We also want to make sure students know they have the right to ask questions. That's a really important piece of this because I know it back to front, the process, it all makes sense to me, but I do this every day. And for most students, this is not something they ever expected to have to encounter while they were at school. And so we want to make sure our students know they can ask questions and that they feel comfortable doing that, whether they're doing that in person, sending me an email, following up via phone, any of those ways. We really encourage students to ask questions. And when you meet with me or one of our staff, you'll find that every couple of sentences we will be saying, do you have any questions about what we just discussed? Students have the right to select that resolution option. So those resolution options that I talked about earlier, students will be able to look at those and have those explained and then determine what they think is the best option for them. Students may decide they want a board hearing, or they may decide that they want something, just with one person so that they're not having to share information with all those people. And that student really, does get to have a say in that if they're participating in the process. And then students have a right to confidentiality under FERPA. So what that means is that the university has limitations in terms of what we can share with other people. So FERPA has some exceptions when it comes to things like health and safety emergency or educational need to know, but we don't use that very broadly. So we're not going to be out here telling faculty like, hey, here's what's going on with this student's case or this student's investigation. We won't speak to parents or friends if we don't have a written release of information in order to do those kinds of things. So you can expect that level of confidentiality. In a few minutes, I'll talk a little bit more about where you can't expect confidentiality and what does get shared throughout a process. So there are a number of rights, and we want to make sure our students, feel comfortable and know that we are really serious about protecting their rights in these processes. We also feel like students who are participating in an investigation do have some responsibilities as well that we want them to understand. So we hope our students will come prepared for their meeting or their hearing. When we send a letter, it usually has a good amount of information in it, links to our student code of conduct, video that you can watch of me explaining some things. In addition to that, there is an incident report that explains what this is about, and some other important information about, retaliation and those kinds of things. So we hope our students will read that before they come to our meeting and come prepared with questions. We also expect our students to be honest and engaged in the process. So you are required to tell the truth throughout our investigation and hearing process. If it's determined that somebody has been untruthful or dishonest in a process, we may have to bring a further conduct case, and we do not like to have to do that. So we want to make sure students understand that it's really important that they're forthcoming with the information. Excuse me. Students always have that right to share additional information as well. So we want to make sure they know that they can provide anything that we don't already have that they think is relevant. And we want to make sure that they do that so that we can put together that full picture. So we feel that there is a responsibility for that. I kind of talked about coming prepared, but we do want all of our students to read and review all of that information that they receive. And then overall, we want our students, we feel as though they have a responsibility to contribute to a safe and respectful learning environment here at the university. And then there's a couple other things that we think are important to consider in these processes. So we do provide interim measures when necessary. The most common interim measure that we use is a no contact directive. That's especially useful when there is a situation where there has been some kind of conflict. And ultimately, when you're talking about something like discrimination or harassment, that is related to a conflict of ideas, a conflict of behaviors, that kind of stuff. And so if there has been an allegation of, for example, discrimination or harassment, a no contact directive is something that we will offer to the parties as kind of a precautionary measure and a way to ensure that the conflict and the conduct hopefully will cease. So a no contact directive is a mutual directive that basically says neither party can have any kind of direct contact with the other. So no contact through phone, email, direct talking, social media, any of that kind of stuff. No contact with the other's belongings, and no contact through a third party. So they can't tell somebody like, please tell the other party this for me. That could be really helpful just in kind of de-escalating a situation, making sure things don't continue. And if it's a situation where students, say, are in the same class together or in an organization together, things like that, we will work with the appropriate faculty to make sure that they can still participate without violating those no contact directives. Occasionally, we do need to do something like an interim suspension. We tend to reserve those for situations where there is a physical safety threat to the individual or the campus, so we don't do those very often. And that is a temporary or an immediate removal from campus until we can receive other information. As part of the interim measures, sometimes we will also work with your program or your faculty to see if there needs to be a change of schedule, the ability to take classes remotely, things like that, to help reduce some of the harm and allow students to continue focusing on their schoolwork without feeling as though they have to think about this situation all the time or engage with the other individuals involved. I mentioned before a timeline and how timeline can be very hard to pinpoint in some of these situations. So there's a lot of things that contribute to timeline. One of those being that the type of work that I do is very unpredictable. And so we have cases coming in on a regular basis, and some of those do have to be prioritized over other cases. The other thing that is really a big impact on timeline is availability and scheduling of the individuals involved. So we know that students are very busy, especially if you're talking about students in the medical school. You have very intense schedules. If you're in a residency or a rotation somewhere, you may be working long hours and your schedule may not always fit into what we have available right away. So sometimes that can put a delay on an investigation as well. And if we have a lot of witnesses or folks that we need to talk to, obviously that can take a little bit of time. So our timelines can range, as I mentioned before, anywhere from a few weeks up through a few months typically for an investigation into a hearing process. The other thing I wanted to follow up on as well is the confidentiality piece. So while we provide confidentiality as a university and we are limited in what we can share, students who are participating in a process do have the right to share their own personal information with other people if they want, as well as their own opinions. So we can't put a gag order on students involved in a process. There are some limitations to that, in that any type of behavior that is deemed to be tampering with an investigation, so telling witnesses not to participate, telling them what they should or shouldn't say, that kind of thing would be a violation. But simply talking to someone and saying, this is what I'm experiencing, or, did you witness this? That kind of stuff is not going to be a violation. And again, as I said, we can't stop that because of those free speech rights that individuals do have. There are concerns, sometimes whether something does then continue to reach into harassment type situation, and it's going to depend a lot on what is being said. So if there are any concerns that somebody is doing something that is inappropriate for a process, we just ask that you reach out to us and we can discuss the information and let you know whether or not there's something there that we need to follow up on. But we do want to, make sure folks understand that while the university may not share the information, we do not always have the ability to stop the students and other folks involved from sharing what they're experiencing. The last thing that's really important to know is how to report anything to the university. So at the bottom of every University of Toledo webpage is our report a concern link. You can also just go to www.utoledo.edu/report. There's 4 reporting forms on that page. There is a Title IX and sexual misconduct reporting form. There's a discrimination and harassment reporting form. There's a general conduct reporting form. And then there is a Rocket Care report for if you have a concern about a student or you're going through some kind of personal crisis that you need support with. The discrimination and harassment forms are all routed through human resources at the university. That's a kind of safety mechanism so that, for example, if somebody, submitted a discrimination complaint against me or somebody else who's copied on the other reports, we would not see that. It would go directly to HR and they could handle it. What that does mean is sometimes there's a small delay when it comes to receiving those reports. So it'll go to HR and then they will send it over to me if it is a student related situation, and then I will take it over from there. There's a couple kind of details that are really specific to discrimination harassment complaints that we have to keep in mind. There are things that we're looking at with these situations that are, sometimes a little bit murkier, I would say, than what we might be looking at, if you think about like underage drinking or, damage, that kind of thing. With these situations, we really have to understand what impact happened, how that impact occurred, why these specific people were involved, and look at things like language, timelines, stuff like that, because it can be very hard to say whether or not something was specifically discrimination or harassment. There are times where things do feel very harmful and hurtful and difficult to deal with, but they fall again into that realm of free speech. And in those situations, we will still do what we can to make sure we educate our students. So we do have options such as a coaching meeting where we can still meet with students and discuss why that behavior is harmful, offer educational opportunities, things like that, but where there's not a formal conduct action that we do take. With discrimination harassment complaints as well, we do often have to meet with a lot of witnesses. And so that can take time. And it's really important for folks to understand that witnesses for us are not only people who have direct eyewitness information. We also want to talk to people who have other types of relevant information. So sometimes that can look like, the person that you reported this to first, or if there was a person that you talk to regularly and said, this is what I'm experiencing, that's going to be somebody that's important for us to talk to as well. Credibility is a really big part of our process. And so we need to understand, is the story consistent? Is the experience consistent? Is this person behaving in a way that makes sense? Things like that. And so that's something that we look at a lot throughout our investigation processes as well. Again, we want to work as much as we can with the individual programs and colleges as well to support students going through these processes. It can be very hard because you do have to come and tell all of this information to us. We will then send you your notes to review. You'll then get an investigation report that has all of that in there. And so we understand from a trauma-informed perspective that reading that and relaying all that information can be really hard to go over and over again. And so we work with our students to make sure that they have the resources in place and the support in place to work through that kind of stuff. So I always suggest to students who are going through our process that they utilize any kind of mental health resources that are available. So at the university, we have both the psychiatry resources as well as the University Counseling Center, which is free to our students. And so we want to make sure they understand they can use that. And then it's also confidential. We also talk through receiving accommodations for disabilities, because that can be important in our process and important in reducing some of the impact that might be going on in other areas of their life when they're also going through this process. And then we like to help as much as we can to make sure our students have connections to people like advisors and support people who can work through these processes with them as well. We talk to faculty and the appropriate, program chairs and things like that to determine, are there ways that we can adjust things for the students in the classroom and in their other schedules to make sure that they can continue to participate fully in their education while this process is occurring. It can be difficult because the outcome is not always what somebody wants. Anytime you're talking, especially about things like discrimination, harassment, or sexual misconduct, regardless of whether the outcome is that a student is found responsible, there's pretty much always harm that's been done. So even if somebody is found responsible, that student is going to have some outcomes based on that. But other individuals that were involved, were still harmed in that process. And so that responsible finding doesn't always make it go away. And so we also want to encourage our students to get the support that they need around those types of things, and understanding that these can be impactful situations. And we hope that there is that ability to learn and have that harm restored really on both sides of a situation. So that's something we focus on a lot in our process. It is not just a very kind of like sanitized, we're just going to stick to this cut and dry thing. We recognize that we are working with humans here, that we are working with very delicate situations, that we are working with people who are already in a stressful environment because they are trying to learn, especially if they're trying to become doctors and they have so much information that they have to keep in their heads and they have so much intense scheduling going on. And so we really try to keep that in mind throughout our process. We encourage our students to share with us if they are struggling, to share with us if they need to, cut something short or reschedule a meeting, things like that, so that they do feel, comfortable as much as possible throughout the process. So lastly, just wanted to make sure again that folks know where they can find us. Our office is located on the main campus. However, I will happily come over to health science anytime if that's more convenient for folks. There are a number of office spaces that we can use over there. Additionally, if students prefer to meet in a virtual space, then we can make that possible as well, because we know sometimes that's easier if you've got a very busy schedule or if you are located on, health science versus main campus. If you do want to see us on main campus, we're located in the Student Union 2518. We are inside CASE, inside that Center for Advocacy and Student Experience. And then, of course, you can always contact us via phone or via email if that's easier. When it comes to reporting things, using that reporting link, you can do a report any time of day, 24/7. That link is live, and you can also report things anonymously. We just ask that if you do report something anonymously, you provide enough information that we can follow up on that. So, any names that you can possibly provide, specific dates or times, things like that, because it can be very hard with us to follow up on an anonymous report if we don't have sufficient information there. So that's kind of an overview of our process. I encourage you to familiarize yourself with those various policies, the Student Code of Conduct, Title IX policy, and the non-discrimination policy. I also encourage you to familiarize yourself with any specific codes or professional standards, ethical standards, things like that for your specific programs as well. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And if anybody has questions, please feel free to go ahead and ask any questions. Like I said, you can put those in the chat, or if you want to unmute and ask me questions, you can also do that. And I'm going to make the slides available as well to go along with this recorded session, so that if people want to look at the slides, they can do that too.
Thank you, Alex, for a very good and interesting learning presentation that you gave today.
Yeah, you're
I would
welcome.
like to know if anybody have any question. Please feel free, unmute yourself and go ahead. We have the expert here that can answer our question and our doubts about any of this topic, or like she say, please feel free to write in the chat that she can answer this question for you.
Yeah. If you want to message just me in the chat, then I can answer without stating who asked the question. I know sometimes people prefer to stay anonymous. One of the things I didn't mention that I think is important to know about our process as well is that our standard of proof is very different than what they use in a court. So we use a standard of proof called preponderance of the evidence, which basically says more likely than not did the policy violation occur. We just have to be just over 50% sure that something happened. Sometimes we talk about like the scales of justice. So instead of having to tip a scale all the way this way, we just have to tip it a little bit, like, the weight of a feather, basically, in order to determine that something did occur. So we do need less information than they would in the courts, where they're looking at something like 75 to 100% sure. But obviously, we still want to make sure that we're very thorough and that we collect all of the appropriate information in these types of situations. And then I will say, if you don't have any questions today, or if you are watching this recording at a later time, please feel free to send us any questions, give me a call, send me an email, whatever it may be, and I can happily answer those.
Absolutely. Looks like we don't have any questions so far. I will like to thank you, Alex, for
Yeah.
being here and share with us your knowledge about this topic that they are extremely important to know how to differentiate and how to process any complaint about discrimination or harassment at the University of Toledo.
Yeah.
Thank you very much again. And if nobody have any question or in the chat, I think so that we are done.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much for having me. And as I said, please feel free to reach out. We work all summer here at the university. We don't take it off. So if you need anything during the summertime because you're in classes, we will be available as well. Thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thank you. You too.
Oh,
Bye
looks
bye.
like Candace does have one question. Sorry, go ahead, Candace.
Sorry, I didn't have a
That's okay.
question. I was just going to give you a hands up. Thank you
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
to talk. I just got my
Thank you. Thank you,
Goodbye.
everybody. Have a
Thank
good
you.
night. Thank you.